And we're live. Welcome to Thursday's edition of the Great Philosophers at Fanshawe College. That's PHIL-1006-40 online. So today we're talking a little bit about medieval philosophy because we're pressing that fast forward button. We're going to move from Aristotle and the schools of philosophy that kind of followed in the wake of the disintegration of the Athenian Empire and the rise of the Roman Empire. So we're talking after Aristotle, of course, the Cynics, the Stoics, the Epicureans. Kenny's chapters on these thinkers are really wonderful. They're very readable. So let me just draw your attention to a couple of the things on the website right now. So first of all, I've made a new announcement. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm going to record live streams around this time. I'm sorry, I wish I could be very consistent and promise you it would be at 1 p.m. every day, but I can't. My domestic situation is too chaotic to allow that. But somewhere between 12:30 and 1:30, I hope to start Tuesdays and Thursdays. Do one module, then the next module. Another thing I want to draw your attention to is this link here in my announcements. If you are logged into Fanshawe Library's website, you should be able to click on this link, and it will take you to Anthony Kenny's A Brief Illustrated History of Western Philosophy, an illustrated brief history. You click PDF full text here, and I should say just kind of accept, and hopefully it'll load. There it is. So you can kind of read the book online this way. I myself definitely enjoy having paper copies of things, but this works just fine. So what we are reading, right, we have Greek philosophy after Aristotle, and we're kind of skipping to early medieval philosophy. Right, we have Anselm here, and we're also going to be reading about Occam, William of Occam and Aquinas. So the reading list is, of course, online. Finally, I do also want to point out that online quiz number 1 has been extended to tonight, just to help you newcomers in the class catch up. And 10 days from now, the first essay is due. Now, it's not very long, so you should be able to do it pretty quickly, but I want you to read those instructions, choose a topic, and write me a great essay. I'm really looking forward to reading them. So, and again, I'm going to try to be live on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you have any questions, I'm going to keep an eye on that live chat box. If you're not live, I don't usually have viewers, that's fine, but I do get views, because this lecture is going to, of course, be recorded for later, so you can go onto YouTube and watch it whenever you need to. And I'm always available to answer your questions over email. I'm poking my head in the discussion forums every now and again to see how things are going there, so just let me know. All right, so this week we are talking about some medieval philosophers. Kenny focuses on a number of thinkers, including early kind of Neoplatonist Christian philosophers. My device will restart outside of active hours. No thanks, Windows. But we're just going to focus on a few big thinkers because we can't spend a lot of class time. We have a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to focus on Anselm, Aquinas, and William of Occam. So those are the chapters you should look at in Kenny. Let's see, where are my slides? Here they are. Week 6. No, that's all wrong. Okay, so I have a bunch of things I need to change here. So that's module, because of course this is an accelerated class. It's actually module 4. Not week 6, not week 4. So we're going to be talking about Anselm, Aquinas, William of Occam. I'm going to try to keep this a little bit short, so I might skip some slides over. It's going to give you really the important aspects. We have a nice full screen here, great. And yeah, I'm going to also change this down here. Okay. So we're going to skip forward to Anselm, and we're going to ignore some stuff that kind of happened in between, mostly because I want to focus on the ontological argument as another good example of philosophical argument. We've seen a few of these already. For example, the Euthyphro dilemma is a nice example of a classic philosophical argument. The third man argument that Aristotle put against Plato. These are abstract arguments in the service of a conclusion that is distinctly philosophical. So who was Saint Anselm? He was a Benedictine monk, later the Archbishop of Canterbury, back when this was a Catholic office before the Protestant Reformation. A lot of his career was pretty political in the sense that he was defending the papacy from a number of charges. For example, the investiture controversy, which was this conflict of whether the kings or popes should elect bishops. Here the church won. So a lot of his theological writings were really kind of contextual to the time. But Anselm was also writing, and this was kind of what was starting to happen, this kind of early, late medieval period. He also wanted to demonstrate theology as a rational system. So one of the things Christian, or especially medieval Christian philosophers were kind of thinking was a distinction between revelation and reason. Revelation is kind of when you get like a story in the Bible of like there's a burning bush appearing before Moses, and the burning bush says, you need to go do these things. That's revelation. That's something that is not necessarily a rational experience. It is truth that is just kind of revealed to you by a kind of a supernatural experience that you have to have. It's not something that you can reason or argument, give reasons or give an argument about to convince other people. You have to have that experience. You have to see the burning bush for yourself. But Anselm and other Christian theologians at the time said Christianity is not just a doctrine given to us by revelation, it's also a rational system. It's something that our reason should be able to demonstrate. So in his own words, I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but believe that I might understand. Unless I first believe, I shall not understand. To me, it seems to be negligence if, after confirmation in faith, we do not study to understand that which we believe. So the idea, of course, is that there's this compatibility between revelation and reason. Reason is not a threat to revelation, rather it's going to supplement it. Faith still comes first, of course, but faith and reason don't conflict. And in the Proslogion, I don't know how to pronounce it, he does provide, and this is kind of the interesting abstract philosophical argument here that I want to focus on, a single argument that needed nothing but itself alone for proof. That would by itself be enough to show that God really exists. Let me focus in on needing nothing but itself alone for proof. This is actually a really interesting feature of the ontological argument. So some arguments, there's lots of arguments for God's existence. Some arguments for God's existence rely on outside premises. For example, the argument from design. That's one we might have heard of before. The argument from design says that the natural world is so complex and so well put together, has such a incredibly complex architecture of mutual interdependency that it needs a designer to explain it. It would be, or as William Paley would put it later in the 18th century, if you're walking along the beach and you find a watch, you don't assume nature put a watch together. You assume there's a watchmaker. Likewise, if you observe the universe, you assume there must be a divine watchmaker. But the argument for design relies on the observation that the universe is ordered, is complex, is mutually interdependent in its systems. And therefore, the argument relies on some kind of an empirical aspect to it, that you make this observation. However, Anselm's ontological argument does not have an empirical basis. It uses reason alone. In philosophical terms, we might call it an a priori argument. I.e., a priori means it comes before observation. You don't need to have any specific experiences to understand the argument. This is going to actually become really important later when we talk about Descartes. But I don't want to put Descartes before the horse. So an a priori argument is is an argument that you don't need any specific experiences to see as valid. So Anselm here is providing an a priori argument based on reason alone that God exists. That doesn't depend on observation. Like, for example, the argument from design depends on observation of the world. So today we call it the ontological argument. Ontological is a word that has to do with the study of what can be said to exist at a really fundamental level. So the ontological argument is the argument that God exists. It's one of those arguments that have resulted, like, there's been thousands of pages, millions of pages have been written about it. But really, this one chapter for one book is Anselm's big, lasting claim to fame for having put this one together. Probably he stole it. He didn't steal it exactly. Probably, refined it from some prior kind of suggestion. And the history here is interesting. But what is the argument? The argument is that a necessary being necessarily exists. A necessary being necessarily exists. What does that mean? All right. Well, let me put it this way. So imagine the greatest possible being. So the greatest possible being is a being that none greater than which could be conceived. So imagine the best possible thing. It has, it's all good, it's all powerful, it's all knowing, right? So I'm just kind of clicking off the list of all things that could be great about a being. And then I get to another checkbox which says, but does this being exist? And this is kind of a yes or no question. Does the greatest possible being exist? If you say no, well, then it lacks a property, existence. So you didn't actually imagine the greatest possible being, because there's one that's even possibly greater, the one that does exist. Again, imagine a set of properties that belong to the greatest possible being. I'm checking them off. I get to the existence box. If it doesn't have the existence box, it is not the greatest possible being. There's one greater than that. Greater how? It actually exists. Right? So we can imagine a being with all the attributes of perfection, and then we ask ourselves, does it exist? If it's no, then there's a greater possible being, one that does exist. All right, so Anselm says the greatest possible being necessarily exists, for existence is a necessary property of it. And this has to be God, because God, the only way the argument works is if we imagine a being with all the perfections, with all the greatness. And if it lacks the attribute of existence, we're not actually thinking of the greatest being. There has to be another being, one that greater, the one that actually does exist. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait a minute, I feel like I'm being hoodwinked here. And maybe we are, right? How could using reason alone, it seems like we kind of twisted ourselves into a philosophical knot to prove something exists? But again, it's a simple kind of yes or no problem, right? I'm imagining something with all possible great attributes. Does it have the attribute of actually existing? Well, then it's not the greatest possible beings. It is greater to exist than not exist. Actually, is it greater to exist than not exist? So that's kind of an assumption you can question here. So the ontological argument, hopefully you're still with me on this one. It's one of those abstract, crazy philosophical arguments. Relies on logic alone, right? Even the first cause argument from design, all these arguments rely on reasoning about causation, observations about the universe. But the ontological argument is just a purely logical argument. Now, there are criticisms of this argument. One way of pushing back on it is to say what it really asserts is that either God is necessary or God is impossible, and not merely contingent. What does that mean? A contingent statement is something that could be true or false. For example, it's contingent that I'm wearing this specific shirt today. I could have worn a different shirt. So there's a possible world, another timeline where I chose a different shirt from my closet today. However, some things are necessary. An example of a necessary statement, something that could not have been different, is that 2 plus 2 is 4. Right? There's no timeline where I Rick and Morty myself using my portal gun into a different dimension where 2 plus 2 is 5. There might be a dimension where the word 4, where the concept 4, we use the sound 5 to mean it, but there's no world where 2 plus 2 is 5. Likewise for God's existence. God is not a contingent being, the argument says. So either the idea of God itself is logically contradictory, or God necessarily exists. And that really puts a difficult burden of proof on the atheist. So even best case scenario, right? For the atheist, the argument is something like, you don't just have to prove that God doesn't exist. You have to prove that God can't possibly exist. And that's actually a lot harder to do. You have to say the idea of God itself is contradictory. So here's some other criticisms here of the ontological argument. Some people say, like, I forget this. Somebody was talking about the greatest possible island. I forget who's arguing, but imagine the greatest possible ice cream, right? By the same token, right? Imagine the greatest possible ice cream cone. Imagine it doesn't exist, then it's not the greatest possible ice cream cone. So the greatest possible ice cream cone must necessarily exist. But this is absurd, therefore the ontological argument as a whole is absurd. Now, the problem with this criticism is probably that if there was the greatest possible ice cream cone, it would literally be God. Because the greatest possible ice cream cone must also be all-knowing, all-powerful, right? Because otherwise it's lacking perfections. So the greatest possible ice cream cone is God. The greatest possible cell phone is God, right? So on and so forth. There's only one greatest possible being. Another argument that to me has a little more punch to it is Immanuel Kant's much later argument. We're going to get to Kant later, but let me talk about his criticism of the ontological argument while we're hanging out here together, all one viewer. So Kant says the mistake made in Anselm's ontological argument is to assume that existence is just another box you're checking off in your list of potential properties, right? So I'm going like, oh, well, are you all good? Are you all powerful? Are you all knowing? Are you everywhere? Do you exist outside of time? Do you smell great? Click, click, click. But do you exist? And that's just like a box I'm ticking off. But Kant says, no, this is the mistake here. Existence is not a property. It's not a predicate. There's something really nonsensical to say that there exists a thing that either does or does not have the property of existing. Right? You hear that problem? Here's the thing. Does it exist? Yes or no? But it does exist, because otherwise what am I attributing to the property of existence? It has to exist to have a property. Only things that exist have properties, so existence can't be a property. All right, so that's your problem right there. All right, existence is not a property like the other ones, right? Because otherwise, in my office right now, there's infinitely many things that just happen to lack the property of existing, right? Here's a purple elephant over here, just lacks the property of existing, but that's weird. So existence is not a predicate, and that's Anselm's problem there. Earlier, Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, actually did not like the ontological argument. St. Thomas Aquinas said St. Anselm was wrong because it assumes we can understand as mortals perfection, and that's hubris. So, Anselm is asking us to conceive of the greatest possible being, but this is impossible for humans. We can't imagine perfection. So the argument doesn't work. So that's St. Thomas Aquinas. Last criticism of the ontological argument, because we have more slides to go. How am I doing for time here? I've been live for almost half an hour already. Last criticism of the ontological argument is that the greatest possible being cannot logically exist, so it's actually impossible because its properties conflict. What does this mean? So earlier I said the argument might show that either God is necessary or impossible. So it's not that God could exist but happens to not exist. Either God necessarily exists or is impossible. God is not contingent. So the argument here would be God is impossible on the grounds that properties, maximally perfect properties, conflict with each other. You can't have them all. So, for example, some people say omniscience is actually in conflict with omnipotence. You can't know everything and do everything. Those two clash with each other. What is just more concretely say, right? There might be a conflict. You might think between knowing everything that's going to happen in the future and giving beings free will. You can't have both. So there's a conflict there. Some people have also argued that being a personal God can't also be infinite, right? So these properties conflict. So these are kind of standard criticisms of the ontological argument. Now, I spent a lot of time on it because there's a paper topic here, and there's probably going to be quiz and midterm questions on the ontological argument. Because I don't want to see this just as a history class where you kind of tell me what some philosophers believed or argued for, then you correlate the names of famous philosophers with words that they used in their arguments. I really want you to understand the arguments, understand the structure of the ontological argument, and why the criticisms, right, either miss their mark or are believable to you, or seem reasonable to you. So it's really about understanding the abstract arguments and not just kind of memorizing names and dates. Okay, moving on to Aquinas and Occam. So a lot of things are happening in the kind of later medieval world. So a lot of Greco-Roman philosophy was actually lost to Europe and survived in translation. A lot of it was surviving in the Islamic world. So a lot of these is really kind of interesting because a lot of these medieval theologians really drew their inspiration from Islamic scholars. And this influence is little known because when you read them, if you're like a medieval scholar, you often have Latinized names like Averroes or Avicenna. But these were 100% Muslim scholars, North Africa and Spain. And their commentaries and translations of Aristotle, for example, really, really important for late medieval philosophy. So this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on medieval philosophy. Spanish translators worked from Arabic texts. In the case of Aristotle, they used Arabic translations of Aristotle's Greek. The relatively sudden injection of new and unfamiliar material was a shock. So again, there's a really interesting history here of where these texts, they were lost after the fall of the Roman Empire and recovered in the late medieval period and really changed the course of European history. Aquinas and Occam here are two important figures of this kind of revolution here as we rediscover the texts of ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. So Occam is best known for Occam's razor. We're going to be talking about that. Aquinas obviously has a bunch of high schools named after him. Also basically reformulated all of Catholicism single-handedly. So, it's pretty important. So, of course, the 13th century, not a great time to be alive. Nevertheless, let's talk about St. Thomas Aquinas. So Pope Pius IX wrote that the capital theses, the arguments, right, the views of St. Thomas are not to be placed in the category of opinions capable of being debated, but are to be considered as the foundations upon which the science of natural and divine things is based. If such principles are removed or in any way impaired, it must necessarily follow that students of the sacred sciences, theology, will ultimately fail to perceive so much as the meaning of the words in which the dogmas of divine revelation are proposed by the Church. So Aquinas, really, really central figure. His basic move was to grab Aristotle and move away from Neoplatonism and towards Aristotle in terms of giving a firm philosophical basis to Christian theology. He wanted to show that Aristotle's view of the soul was compatible with personal immortality, with Christian doctrine, and he wanted to show that Christian doctrine could be true by just reason alone. You don't need revelation to show that the basic ideas of Christianity are true. The two main texts that, if you're interested in Aquinas, you should look at are Summa Contra Gentiles, Summa Theologiae. Contra means against, Gentiles means non-believers. So the sum, right? My arguments against non-believers. So the first of these books argues that Christianity is true as if you're trying to convince an unbeliever. And the second proceeds that Christian religion has been established as true, and then just kind of expands on it. Now, if you're going to try to convert an unbeliever, you can't just say, well, the Bible says it, because the unbeliever doesn't accept the legitimacy of the Bible to begin with. So you have to kind of start before that. Aquinas will be using natural reason to demonstrate the Catholic faith. Now, Aquinas says not everything can be demonstrated by reason alone. I can prove God's existence, for example. God's existence I can just prove using reason, Aquinas says. The doctrine of the Trinity is revealed, however. But nothing in reason contradicts faith, nothing revealed in faith contradicts reason. So these two work together. Again, this is really important for intellectual development at the time, right? To show that rationality cannot conflict with faith is pretty important as a stepping stone to getting a little bit more intellectual freedom at the time. So this was definitely happening in the background, right? The medieval period is a bad time to get caught up in heresy and so on and so forth. So contextually, you have to kind of understand it in this way, that you have to actually argue that it's okay to argue. It's a tricky proposition. So, as I've said, again, I'm just very boulderizing some stuff here, but Aquinas rejects Anselm's ontological argument. It says mortal humans can know enough about God's essence to assert his existence because they can conceive the most perfect being, but finite mortal beings cannot conceive perfection. So forget that argument. Aquinas, because his bro was Aristotle, said, no, we're going to take Aristotle's arguments. These are better arguments. And so he kind of endorsed the old Aristotelian argument about the unmoved mover. Or you can think of it as the cosmological argument, the first cause argument, lots of different ways of kind of thinking through. There's variance on this one, on this argument. But basically it says something like, look, whatever is moved has to be moved by something. So, right, if I'm waving my cell phone around, right, why is the cell phone moving around? Because I'm moving it around. So everything has a cause. What caused me to this example here? What caused me to have this example? The fact that we're in a classroom. Why are we in a classroom? We need an education. Why do we need an education, right? We just kind of keep going. But do we go back infinitely? So the ancient Greeks weren't really, some of the ancient Greeks weren't really worried about this because they actually did believe the universe went back infinitely long in time. In the kind of tradition of Judeo kind of Christian thought, if that is even a thing, the idea is that the universe began, right? In the beginning there was darkness, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, it was good, etc., etc. So causal chains can't go back for infinity. They have to stop. An infinite regress of causation, of moving, is impossible. The chain has to end. And at least one thing that can move things but itself does not need to be moved. And that thing has to be God. The only thing capable of being the end of a causal chain, the end of a chain of movement, has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, outside of time, and so on. It has to have these properties in order to play the role of the unmoved mover, the uncaused causer. Because otherwise, we end up right here, and there's just a big question mark, or there's infinity. So this is the only thing that could explain the beginning of a causal chain. Now, there have been criticisms. Two famous criticisms of the unmoved mover / first cause argument. Look, they're not exactly the same argument, but for the purposes of a gen ed class, let's pretend they're the same argument. One criticism is that the conclusion of an unmoved mover is just a contradiction. An unmoved mover? right? We're establishing a problem of infinite regress, that everything needs a cause, right? You assert in your premises that every cause, right? Everything has a cause. Everything which moves has a mover. But the solution denies that premise, right? Everything needs a cause, so we have a problem. What's our solution? A thing which doesn't need a cause. Well, okay. But didn't you just say the whole problem existed because everything needed a cause, and now you're saying there's actually an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover? Right, so you're contradicting your premise, right? The solution, in other words, claims not everything which moves has a mover. So if not everything that moves needs a mover, why do we have the problem in the first place? Why could it just be like a regular event, since we've already all accepted they're unmoved movers? Why does it need to be all powerful? Right, so that's kind of a problem here. Another problem sometimes people have pushed on this one is the idea that causation or movement is really just a question of physics, not a question of philosophy, and there are uncaused things in the universe, right? Quantum vacuum energy, maybe, right? So you could put in doubt this whole premise that everything needs a cause, that everything needs a mover, because apparently the universe is such that things happen without movement, without there being a mover or a cause. So this really is an observational argument about the nature of causality in the universe, and physics will tell us whether or not this argument is right, not reason alone. All right. So let me talk a little bit about Aquinas and the problem of evil then. Because again, I keep saying we're going to keep this short, and then I keep having hour-long videos. Any comments here? No. Again, I'm watching that live chat box, so let me know. Because they might remember, just in the last module, right? Epicurus, Lucretius, the atomists, right? These kind of like early atheisty. They're not exactly atheists, but for their time, they might have been, right? They were atomists. They believed that death was actually annihilation. It is the end. There's no afterlife. The gods are remote. They don't intervene if they even exist. And Epicurus said, don't worry about the gods. The gods don't interfere, right? And, you know, if the gods are interfering, right, you have to explain to all these problems to me, like the problem of evil. Right? Is God willing to prevent evil but not able to? Right? Because, again, suppose it would cost me, like, God's all-powerful, right? So say it would cost me literally nothing to save a life. Like, it's not even I have to send $5 to Doctors Without Borders, which you should do, by the way. Like, I just snap my fingers and I save 1 million people from an easily preventable disease. If I could do that, and I choose not to do it, I'm a bad person. Is he able but not willing, right? That he's malevolent? If he can't just snap his fingers, he's not all powerful. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Why call him God? Now there's a bunch of, again, classical solutions, like the problem of free will. I've always found the free will argument for evil a little unconvincing, because a lot of bad things happen to us not as a result of free will, but just as a result of the way the universe seems to be structured, with like cancer. Why coronavirus? You know, if all the bad things that happen in the world were just a function of people being dicks to each other, I'd be like, well, all right. But a lot of the suffering here doesn't seem to be our own fault. So that's a really fundamental challenge. And again, a lot of ink has been spilled here. So Aquinas' basic response, and again, this is a great paper topic if you want to do a little bit of research. I can't do it justice in like 5 minutes. But the response of Aquinas is to say, look, our problem is that we're thinking of evil as a separate existing thing, and that somehow it exists. And then you're like, well, why did God create evil? Well, God didn't create evil. He created good, and good is just the absence. So evil is just the absence of good. It's not this objective thing, right? But for example, right, there's no separate people used to believe this, but there's no separate cold substance, right? There's only one thing, which is heat, which is molecular motion, basically. And cold and hot is just how much molecular energy there is in a substance, right? Boiling water is very energetic. Frozen water has very low energy. So cold isn't a separate thing from heat. It's the absence of heat. Likewise, there's no problem of the existence of evil, because evil only exists in relation to good. It's a relative absence of good. Thus, a perfect universe without evil is not possible, because if you want to create good, your evil, the relative lower level of goodness, has to be around. So people have said, like, for example, fire can't exist without burning things. A lion could not exist without eating. So God could not create a universe without evil, with any more than he could create a two-sided triangle, goes the argument, because it's a logical impossibility. If you're going to create good, there's going to be varying amounts of good. And that slight dip in the total amount of good is, we perceive it as evil, but it is not actually a thing in and of itself, Aquinas will say. So we can reframe Epicurus as providing the challenge, not the problem of evil, but the problem of things being slightly less good than they could be. So that's still a challenge, but somehow it doesn't seem as problematic anymore, potentially. Whether you find that satisfying or not, again, great paper topic. And whatever side you come down on it, whether you think the problem of evil is a significant challenge or easily answerable, my opinion doesn't matter. I just want you to write a great paper. So a lot has been written about this. So if you're interested, I have the Wikipedia link. I like Wikipedia. I think it does a pretty good job. And again, every religious tradition tries to answer this problem, because there is suffering in life. Bad things happen to good people for no reason at all. And we need stories, and we need ways of thinking through the problem of human suffering and animal suffering in life. So, I mean, the story of Job, right, in the Christian Bible, a good example of an attempt of dealing with the problem of suffering. Okay, William of Ockham. Let me finish with William of Ockham here, because I am definitely going over time. 45 minutes here. William of Ockham, Occam's razor. Bertrand Russell, in his history of Western philosophy, said of Occam, met the emperor of the time, who Occam, of course, a very political figure as well, says, like, you might defend me with a sword, but I'll defend you with my pen, right? Let me just get to Occam's razor here. Okay, so he wrote, very political guy. He's chiefly known now for his metaphysics, a view called nominalism, which is kind of a view that Platonic universals don't exist, and Occam's razor. Now, what is Occam's razor? Popularly, you might have bumped into it, for example, during arguments online, and you might have heard a version, the simplest explanation is the best one. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. The way Occam phrased it is vain to do with more what can be done with fewer. Right, so the simplest explanation is the best, as long as it actually explains. This became a really important scientific principle later on. And it's a very defensible principle, in the sense that a theory with fewer moving parts has fewer areas of potential failure, fewer things that can go wrong with it. Or again, a scientific theory that makes fewer assumptions is more statistically likely to be true, all things being equal, just because there are fewer falsifiable elements. So you want to keep those falsifiable elements down to a minimum. So as I said, Occam didn't believe in Platonic universals. Universals exist only in name, and the razor comes up in this context because he says you don't need to think universals exist if nominalism is adequate. So this is kind of a burden of proof argument. He says, look, the Platonist needs to demonstrate that nominalism is inadequate first, because nominalism, the view that you don't need to assume Platonic universals, Go back to like module 2 for that. The default position should be they don't exist. It's up to you to justify your existence claim by showing that the existence claim is necessary, right? Because the more assumptions your theory relies on, the more points of failure it could have. Unnecessary assumptions only makes the theory less likely. And this principle is actually kind of really important to science for a number of reasons, right? Part of it to determine who has the burden of proof. It's also because scientific theory, empirical observation, is structured, and necessarily so, you can't escape this problem. You could believe anything in the face of any observations just by introducing new assumptions to your theory. Now, if you have Netflix, there's a great documentary on flat earthers called, I think, Behind the Curve. And the flat earthers set up these experiments to prove the earth is flat. Their experiments constantly fail. The experiments again and again prove that earth is round. But the flat earthers refuse to believe it. So they keep saying, oh, the instrument is miscalibrated. Oh, the moon is influencing it. Oh, it's the atmosphere, the refraction of the air. And you can hold on to your belief by just introducing new reasons for why your observations don't match your theory. However, introducing these new assumptions makes the theory more and more complex. And the razor tells us the more complex your theory is, the less likely it's true, because if you have two theories, the less complex one just has fewer points of failure. And the more complex the theory, the more ungainly it becomes, the less likely it is. So if you find yourself introducing new assumptions to hold on to your theory, when there's another one in the field that does a good job of explaining it with fewer assumptions, go for the simple one. Another example is young Earth creationism. A bit like flat eartherism, right? It's not true. The Earth is not 10,000 years old. And, if you're arguing online about this, you might say, dear young Earth creationists, what about radiometric dating, right? What is radiometric dating? Well, we know that when an element is created, that the half-life of certain unstable elements decays in a predictable stage here. So if you have uranium-238, for example, it will decay to thorium, right, to radium, to lead, to bismuth, right? It takes a long time, days, minutes, but we can sort of tell by gauging the amount left in the rock how old it must be on the basis of the kind of mixture of elements in it. It's a very complicated science, but it's extremely solid science, right? The decay rates have been observed, they've been calculated, and you can use it to date all kinds of elements, the things you find in the world. But if you believe the Earth is 10,000 years old, you're going to have a problem, because radiometric dating will say this rock is 300 million years old. So you can, of course, hold on to your young Earth theory by saying the decay rate of elements has just changed radically. Things used to decay quicker. You weren't around 10,000 years ago, back when uranium-238 was decaying like bang, 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 bang. You weren't there. You are assuming, sir, that decay rates have been consistent over millions of years, but you can't prove that assumption. Therefore, the Earth is young. So this young Earth theory really introduces the assumption decay rates have changed. So it's more complex. Is it possible that decay rates have changed and the Earth is really 10,000? I guess so. But is it likely? Well, we have a pretty complicated theory, right? We also have to say, well, if the Earth is 10,000 years old, I look up to the sky, I see stars out there. These stars are millions of light years away. How did their light get to the Earth, given that it would have taken millions of years for the light of distant stars to reach us now? Well, light used to go faster. You could say that. You could keep introducing these assumptions to explain away observations. But then you have really hugely complex and unnecessarily complex theories where a simpler explanation, the universe is very old, just kind of works better. And you need this in science. So Occam's razor is really important because, again, scientific proof is not like logical proof, right? The certainty of science is the certainty of empirical observation, which has to be updated with new observations, new experiments. You always have the possibility of being wrong in science in a way that math and logic, once you have a proof, you are 100% certain. So science is not logic, and Occam's razor plays a really important part in giving us good theories under conditions of relative uncertainty. That's what I want to say there. I got some anti-razors and jokes here, but that's really all I wanted to say. I know I've gone on a little bit today. That's fine. I like this material. For your essays and midterms, just kind of keep an eye on those dates. If you have any questions, send me an email. Again, I'm going to try to do this around 1 o'clock Tuesdays and Thursdays. And if there's anything at all I can do for you, online, remotely, from my office, please let me know. Thanks for watching, and have a great afternoon.